The first thing people noticed was the smell. Not the clean, grassy smell of spring pasture after rain, not the warm dust of a freshly worked field. It was the sharp, sour smell of wool, mud, and frightened animals packed too close together in an old livestock trailer that rattled like it might split in half before it reached the Whitaker place. By 9 o'clock that April morning, the whole east side of Harper County seemed to know that Clara Whitaker had done something foolish. The trailer came crawling down County Road 18 behind a faded blue pickup with one brown fender and a cracked windshield. Red dust rose behind it in a long, slow cloud. A few neighbors stepped out onto their porches. Two men in seed caps paused beside a mailbox. A white truck from the feed store slowed almost to a stop as it passed the Whitaker gate. Inside the trailer stood 250 sheep. They were not the kind of sheep a sensible farmer bought. They were thin through the ribs, hollow-eyed, dirty-legged, with wool hanging in ragged clumps from their sides. Some looked too tired to lift their heads. A few pressed their noses through the slats and bleated weakly at the dry spring air. Clara Whitaker climbed out of the pickup without looking at the road. She was 24 years old, narrow-shouldered, quiet, with her father's old work shirt buttoned over a faded t-shirt and her hair tucked under a sweat-stained ball cap. She moved slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she had learned that animals trusted steady hands more than fast ones. Across the road, Earl Pritchard leaned against his fence and watched. He was in his late 60s, with sunken cheeks, bowed legs, and hands that had spent 50 years tightening wire and pulling calves. Earl had once helped Clara's father pull a tractor out of a creek bed after a flash flood. He had also been the first man at the diner to say the Whitaker place was finished. His brother sat in a pickup behind him with the window rolled down. Neither man said anything loud enough for Clara to hear, but Earl's face held something more complicated than mockery. He looked at the sheep, then at the sagging Whitaker barn, then at Clara standing alone by the trailer ramp. His mouth tightened, as if he disliked what he was seeing, but disliked saying so even more. The pasture beyond Clara's gate was a bad joke in the county. It rolled west from the barn in 30 uneven acres of thistle, ragweed, bindweed, briars, and brush. The old cattle paths had vanished under weeds waist-high. The soil showed in hard gray patches where rain ran off instead of soaking in. In late summer, the place turned brittle and brown. In winter, the mud swallowed boots. The bank had called it worthless pasture. Mr. Callahan, the banker from town, had stood on that same slope 2 months earlier with his leather shoes sinking into dead grass and his clipboard pressed against his belly. He had told Clara that land like that could not carry cattle, could not grow hay, and could not support the loan her father had left behind. He had said it gently, almost kindly, which somehow made it worse. Now Clara was opening the gate to that same pasture and unloading 250 starving sheep into it. The first sheep stumbled down the ramp, sniffed the ground, and pushed into a tangle of green-gray weeds that no cow on the place had touched in years. Then another followed, then 20 more. Soon the whole ragged flock spread into the pasture like dirty foam, disappearing shoulder-deep in the brush. A truck slowed on the road. Someone laughed. Clara heard it. She did not turn around. She closed the gate, wrapped the chain twice, and stood with one hand on the post while the sheep began tearing at the weeds. Her face stayed calm, but her knuckles were white. Behind her, the old Whitaker farmhouse sat with peeling paint and a rust-streaked tin roof, and beyond it stood the barn her grandfather had built from oak beams before the county road was paved. Everybody driving past that morning thought they were watching a girl throw away the last of her money. Clara looked across the pasture and tried to see it the way her father had taught her to see land, not by what it looked like from the road, but by what was happening under the surface. The weeds were ugly, thick, and stubborn, but they were also standing biomass, rough feed, shade for bare soil, and a chance to start over without buying hay she could not afford. The Whitaker farm had not always looked like something a bank could dismiss with one cold word. Clara's grandfather, Samuel Whitaker, bought the first 80 acres in 1954 with a used truck, a war pension, and a belief that land would answer honestly if a person treated it with patience. He built the farmhouse room by room. He dug the first pond with borrowed equipment. He raised cattle, cut hay, planted windbreaks, and kept notebooks in a square handwriting so careful it looked printed. Clara's father, Daniel, inherited the place during better years. He had the easy strength of a man who knew every gate latch by touch in the dark. He kept beef cattle, sold hay, and taught Clara to drive the old Ford tractor when she was still too small to reach the pedals without sliding forward on the seat. But the good years thinned out. The rains stopped coming on time. Feed prices climbed. Diesel climbed. Fencing wire doubled. One summer burned so hot that the pond shrank to a muddy circle and the cattle bawled at the water trough before daylight. The next spring brought hail that flattened the hayfield. Then Daniel refinanced the farm to keep operating, telling Clara it was only a rough patch. After that, his heart started failing. Clara came home from a community agriculture program 2 states away when the doctors told him not to work alone. She thought she was coming home for a season. She stayed through hospital visits, late-night bills, broken water lines, and mornings when her father stood at the kitchen sink staring out at the pasture as if he could will it green again. By the time Daniel Whitaker died, the farm was still standing, but only in the way an old barn stands after years of wind, upright, tired, and waiting for the next storm to decide its fate. Clara inherited a house that needed a roof, a barn with one sagging wall, a tractor older than her father's first pair of boots, and a banknote that turned every mailbox trip into a test of courage. The cattle were gone, sold in 3 painful groups to cover interest and medical bills. The hayfield was thin. The west pasture had become a thicket. The people around her called it bad luck, but they also called it the end. At the diner, men who had known her since she wore pigtails lowered their voices when she came in. At the feed store, the clerk asked whether she was buying supplies or just looking. The rancher to the south, a man named Wade Hensley, stopped by twice and offered to buy the west side before the bank got involved. He said he hated to see a young woman buried under debt. Clara thanked him and said no. That answer moved around town faster than a storm warning. Some called her proud, some called her sentimental, some said she had too much of her father in her and not enough sense to know when a fight was already lost. Mr. Callahan was not cruel. That was one reason Clara disliked seeing him. A cruel man would have been easier to ignore. Callahan spoke softly, wore clean shirts, and folded his hands when he explained numbers that could erase a family name from a mailbox. He told her the bank needed a real payment before fall. Not a promise, not hope, a payment. He pointed to the pasture figures. He pointed to the failed hay yield. He pointed to the equipment repair estimates. He did not point to the kitchen table where Daniel Whitaker had taught Clara to add columns of expenses. He did not point to the barn beam where Samuel Whitaker had carved the year 1957 with his pocket knife. He did not point to the graves under the cedar trees on the back rise. Numbers did not care about those things. Clara knew that. But she also knew something else. Her father had once told her that a bank sees what land is worth today, while a farmer has to see what it is begging to become. So when Clara spent nearly the last of her operating cash on 250 thin sheep from a drought sale 3 counties over, the town did not see a plan. They saw panic. By noon, the story had reached the feed store. By 2, it had reached the diner. By evening, it had reached Mr. Callahan. People spoke of it while loading mineral blocks into truck beds, while stirring coffee, while standing in the shade of machinery sheds with their arms folded. They said Daniel would have known better. They said a flock that week would need more care than it was worth. They said sheep were trouble, fences were trouble, parasites were trouble, coyotes were trouble, and Clara already had more trouble than any girl her age could carry. They said weeds did not pay banknotes. The first week seemed determined to prove them right. On the second night, 3 sheep found a gap in the south fence and wandered onto the county road, where Clara caught them under a cold moon with a flashlight clenched between her teeth and blood running from a scratch on her wrist. The next morning, Earl Pritchard drove by slowly and saw her hammering new staples into half-rotten posts. He almost kept driving. Then he stopped. He did not get out. He only rolled down his window and watched her bend a rusted staple with the side of a hammer because the post was too rotten to hold it straight. For a moment, Clara expected another joke, another warning, another piece of advice dressed up as wisdom, but Earl only looked at the sheep clustered near the brush line and told her there were coyotes moving along the creek that week. Then he drove away. It was not kindness exactly. It was not support, but it was the first thing anyone had given her that was useful. On the fourth day, the well pump coughed and quit, while the flock was moving into a new paddock. Clara spent 6 hours taking apart fittings, scraping rust, and driving to town for a part she could barely afford. By the end of the first week, one ewe was too weak to stand. Clara bedded her in the old lambing pen, brought warm water, mixed minerals, and sat on an overturned bucket until after midnight, listening to the animal breathe. She did not post pictures. She did not ask for pity. She did not explain herself at the diner. Every morning before sunrise, she walked the pasture with a notebook. She wrote down what the sheep ate first: young ragweed leaves, tender bindweed shoots, the lower parts of thistle before the stalks toughened, briar leaves where they could reach them. She marked where they grazed too hard and where they only nibbled. She moved temporary electric netting every few days, forcing the flock to take the weeds evenly and then leave the ground to rest. At first, it looked messy. Nothing about the place looked like a magazine farm. Orange fence reels leaned against old posts. Water tubs sat in weeds. Clara's boots were always wet or dusty, never clean. The sheep left manure behind in small dark pellets that dotted the bare spots like seed. That was part of it. The secret had started in a dented tin box Clara found after her father's funeral. It had been tucked in the back of a kitchen cabinet behind old canning lids and a jar of mismatched screws. Inside were her grandfather's pasture notebooks, folded maps, newspaper clippings, soil conservation pamphlets from the 1970s, and a handful of pages in Daniel's handwriting. Clara read them at night when grief made sleep impossible. Her grandfather had written about the west pasture before the weeds took it. He had noted which grasses came first after a fire, which slopes dried out earliest, where water stood after heavy rain, and where cattle always overgrazed because the shade was close. He had written that the west field was not poor land by nature, it was tired land, compacted land, land asked to feed too many cattle for too many dry years without rest. Daniel's notes were newer and rougher. He had underlined one sentence from an old extension bulletin: different animals harvest different plants. Below that, he had written one word: sheep. There were records from a small trial he had done before his illness worsened. 27 sheep, borrowed from a neighbor for 6 weeks. The patch they grazed had fewer seed heads the next spring. The soil stayed covered longer. Native grass returned in thin green lines through the old weeds. Daniel had circled the result and written, "Might work if scaled before seed set." He never got the chance. Clara did. She did not buy the thin sheep because they were perfect. They were cheap because the seller had run out of grass and patience. Some were older ewes, some were yearlings. A handful might breed later if they recovered well, but Clara did not count lambs before they existed. She counted forage, weight gain, manure, grazing contracts, and the one resource everybody else had ignored: unwanted growth. The plan was simple only when written down. In real life, it was mud, wire, sweat, and doubt. Graze tight, move often, rest long, hit the weeds before they seeded, let manure feed the soil, let hooves press plant litter into the ground, keep roots alive, keep the land covered. Let the flock turn unwanted growth into weight, wool, fertility, and eventually cash. Clara also saw something no one in town had bothered to price. Every farm around her was fighting weeds. Every roadside ditch, orchard edge, overgrown field, and abandoned lot had brush that cost money to mow, spray, or burn. If her sheep grew strong enough, She could bring the flock to other properties and charge for targeted grazing. The idea would have sounded ridiculous if she had announced it too soon. So she did not announce it. She worked. May turned hot. The sheep began filling out slowly. Their eyes cleared. Their wool still looked rough, but their backs no longer showed sharp under every step. There were no spring lambs skipping in the pasture, no sudden miracle of new life that erased the hard math. Just animals recovering ounce by ounce, day by day, on feed everyone else had dismissed. The pasture changed in ways most people could not see from the road. Thistleheads disappeared before they flowered. Bindweed thinned where the flock hit it early. The hard, bare places stayed shaded by trampled stems instead of baking open in the sun. When Clara dug her fingers into the soil after a storm, the water had gone deeper than before. She wrote it all down. Still, the bills kept coming. Veterinary medicine, mineral, fence chargers, replacement posts, fuel, a tire for the pickup, pump parts, bank notices in white envelopes that looked harmless until she opened them. One night in June, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with every light off except the one above the stove. A storm moved north of the farm without dropping rain. Thunder rolled like a promise broken at the county line. The bank letter lay open beside her father's notebook. The payment due was larger than the money she had. For the first time since buying the sheep, Clara let herself imagine calling Wade Hensley and asking whether his offer still stood. She imagined signing papers, cleaning out the barn, taking her father's coat from the hook by the door, watching someone else's cattle move across the west pasture. Her throat tightened so hard she could not swallow. Then the ewe she had nursed through that first week began crying from the old pen behind the kitchen wall. Clara went out in her socks, crossing the cold mud without bothering to find her boots. The ewe was standing now, thin but alive, chewing slowly under the yellow barn light. Clara leaned her forehead against the stall board and cried there, where no one could see her. Not the clean kind of crying that comes with relief, the ugly kind. The kind that bends a person over and leaves them ashamed of needing air. She cried because she missed her father. She cried because she was tired of being watched. She cried because every decision felt like a door locking behind her. When it passed, she wiped her face with her sleeve and stood in the barn listening to the sheep breathe. Inside the house, her father's notebook lay open on the kitchen table. The sentence she had read 100 times waited for her under the stove light. Land does not lie. People just stop listening too soon. Before dawn, she was back outside. The county had a way of punishing hope in July. The rain quit. At first, people called it a dry spell. Then the ponds began shrinking. Then lawns in town turned silver. Then the hayfields curled. By the 40th day, dust hung behind every truck like smoke. By the 60th day, men who had spent all spring laughing at Clara were standing in feed stores asking about hay prices with pale faces. Cattle bawled over empty pastures. Ranchers began selling early. Mowers sat idle because there was not enough grass worth cutting. The big fields that had looked clean and proper in May turned brittle and exposed under the sun. The west pasture at Whitaker Farm surprised people because it did not collapse all at once. From the road, it still looked rough. Nobody would have mistaken it for lush grass. But the grazed paddocks held low cover instead of open dirt. Trampled stems shaded the ground. Green threads of regrowth showed between the old weed crowns. The sheep moved calmly through sections that still offered feed when neighboring land had gone yellow. Clara had not beaten drought. She had bought time. That was the part that made people slow down on the road. In town, hay prices climbed high enough to frighten even established ranchers. Wade Hensley sold 1/3 of his cattle. Earl Pritchard stopped smiling when he drove past. A week after the worst heat settled in, he left 2 rolls of old woven wire beside Clara's gate while she was moving the flock. There was no note. The wire was rusted in places, but usable. Clara knew it was Earl's because one strand was patched with the same twisted knot he used on every fence he owned. She did not thank him in town. He would have hated that. She used the wire. Mr. Callahan called Clara into the bank and told her plainly that the fall deadline still stood. The bank could not carry the loan on effort, no matter how hard she was working. 30 days, he said. Clara drove home with both hands on the wheel and the air conditioner broken, hot wind roaring through the cab. That afternoon, the first real opportunity arrived. It came from the owner of an apple orchard 12 miles east of town. His lower blocks had been overtaken by weeds and brush after 2 bad seasons. He could not afford another round of mowing and spraying, and fire risk was too high to ignore. He had heard, not from someone kind, but from someone amused, that Clara Whitaker had a flock eating everything in sight. Clara walked his orchard the next morning. She saw grasshoppers snapping through dry leaves. She saw weeds around trunks, brush along the fence, fallen fruit beginning to rot, and enough unwanted growth to feed her sheep without touching the trees if she fenced carefully. She gave him a price. He stared at her for a long moment, then agreed. The first contract did not save the farm, but it opened a door. Clara hauled the flock in groups, set up portable fencing, brought water tanks, and moved the sheep through the orchard lanes with the same careful notes she used at home. The animals ate the weeds down, they cleaned under the trees, they left manure behind. The orchard owner saved money, Clara got paid. Then a vineyard called. Then a small solar site outside town. Then a widow with 20 overgrown acres she could not mow anymore. By late summer, Clara was running 2 businesses that fed each other. The grazing contracts paid for fuel, fencing, mineral, and the banknote. The off-farm weeds helped carry the flock through the drought. The recovered sheep gained weight on land other people had been paying to clear, and every job left Clara with a stronger flock, better references, and another entry in her ledger. In September, she sold the first group of recovered market lambs and several cull ewes at prices nobody had expected. She kept the healthiest ewes for breeding the following season, not because they had already given her lambs, but because they had survived drought, adapted to the rotation, and proved they could turn rough forage into body condition. A local fiber cooperative bought a modest wool clip after Clara cleaned and sorted it with help from a woman in the next county. A farm-to-table restaurant placed a small order for lamb after the orchard owner told the chef her story. The money came in pieces at first. A check from the orchard, a check from the vineyard, a deposit for a roadside brush-clearing job, livestock sales, wool sales, another grazing job scheduled for early spring. The title number, the one people would repeat later, was not 6 months of profit from 250 sheep. It was the total first-season revenue Clara could document across every line connected to the flock: targeted grazing contracts, recovered livestock sales, wool, deposits for scheduled jobs, and the appraised value of the breeding ewes she retained instead of selling at a loss. The ledger crossed $120,000 only when all of it was counted together. She checked the math 3 times because she did not trust the feeling in her chest. The net was smaller, as every farmer knew it would be. Fuel took a bite. Fencing took a bite. Veterinary care, hauling, mineral, repairs, and equipment rental took their share too. But after expenses, there was enough. Enough to walk into Mr. Callahan's office with the overdue payment and a written plan for the next 12 months. The banker looked at the check, then at the grazing contracts, then at the list of ewes retained for breeding. For once, he did not have a soft explanation ready. He cleared his throat and said the bank would update the account. Clara nodded. She did not smile until she was back in the pickup. The news spread differently this time. No one laughed at the feed store when the orchard owner said Clara's sheep had saved him thousands. No one joked at the diner when the county agent asked if she would host a pasture walk for farmers interested in targeted grazing. Earl Pritchard stopped by the fence one evening and stood there so long Clara finally walked over. He did not apologize with pretty words. Men like Earl rarely did. He looked across the west pasture, where native grass was showing in soft green patches between the controlled weeds, and asked how often she moved the sheep. Clara told him. Then he asked what kind of fence charger she used. She told him that too. After a while, Earl took off his cap and looked toward the old Whitaker barn. The setting sun turned the rusted roof copper. He said her father had once tried something like this on the north slope before he got sick. He said Daniel had been excited about it, though most men in town had laughed then too. Earl said he had laughed with them because it was easier than admitting he did not understand it. Clara did not answer right away. The wind moved through the grass between them. Then Earl reached into the bed of his truck and handed her a coffee can full of old gate insulators, the porcelain kind that lasted forever if they did not break. He said he had no use for them anymore. Clara took the can with both hands, and for the first time since the sheep arrived, Earl looked her straight in the face without pity. After that, trucks began stopping at the Whitaker gate for reasons other than gossip. Farmers asked about paddock size. Ranchers asked about weeds sheep preferred. A young couple with 10 rough acres asked whether Clara would bring the flock in spring. Even Mr. Callahan came out in polished boots again, though this time he stood on the edge of the pasture and listened, while Clara explained rest periods, stocking density, and why land that looked messy could still be healing. The county agent took soil samples from the West Pasture and compared them with older records. The numbers were not magic, but they were moving. More cover, better infiltration, less bare ground, more useful forage returning, where the sheep had passed and the land had rested. The pasture had not become perfect in one season, but it had stopped dying. That was enough. That winter, Clara fixed the barn wall with money earned from weeds. She replaced the worst stretch of south fence. She put a new roof on the lambing shed before the first hard freeze. She kept her father's coat on the hook by the back door, and her grandfather's notebooks in the kitchen, no longer hidden in a tin box but open beside her own. In February, nearly 10 months after the trailer first rattled through the gate, the lambs came for real. They arrived in the bitter part of morning, when frost silvered the fence wire and the barn smelled of straw, wool, and steam. Clara carried 1 week newborn inside her jacket, the way her father had once done. She warmed it by the stove, fed it with a bottle, and wrote the time of birth in her ledger. Outside, the Whitaker Farm sign still hung at the road. The paint was faded, the post leaned a little, but it was still there. By the next spring, the West Pasture looked different enough that strangers noticed before neighbors admitted it. The thistle had not vanished, but it no longer ruled the field. The ragweed came back thinner. Grass filled spaces that had been bare. The soil held rain longer. The flock moved over the land in calm white clusters, harvesting what others had called waste. Clara never stood up in the diner to tell people they had been wrong. She did not need to. Their silence did that for her. The same men who once said sheep could not eat a banknote now watched her trailer roll past and wondered whose land she had been hired to clear. The same banker who called the pasture worthless now used words like alternative revenue and asset recovery. The same county that had seen her as a stubborn young woman began seeing her as someone who understood the ground beneath their boots in a way they had forgotten. And Clara still worked the same way she had from the beginning. She rose before daylight. She checked water, fence, hooves, weather, and grass. She carried a notebook in her back pocket. She listened more than she talked. She treated the land like an old family member that needed time, rest, and the right kind of care. Years later, people in Harper County would tell the story differently depending on who was telling it. Some would say Clara Whitaker got lucky buying cheap sheep at the right time. Some would say the drought made her business. Some would say the bank pushed her hard enough to force a new idea. But the people who really paid attention knew the truth was quieter than that. She had seen value where others saw weeds. She had read the records of those who came before her. She had trusted animals to do what machines and chemicals could not do cheaply anymore. She had endured ridicule without wasting strength on anger. She had let the land answer in its own time. On an evening in late May, Clara stood at the top of the West Pasture as the sun dropped behind the cottonwoods. The flock spread below her, full and quiet, moving through a section of brush that would become green again by fall. The old farmhouse windows caught the light. The barn no longer leaned. The road beyond the gate was empty. She held her grandfather's map in one hand and her own updated pasture plan in the other. The old lines and new lines did not match exactly. They were not supposed to. A legacy was not something a person froze in place. It was something they learned from, repaired, and carried forward. At the fence, Clara paused beside the Whitaker Farm sign and brushed dust from the carved letters. The bank had called her pasture worthless. The town had called her foolish. But the sheep, the weeds, the soil, and the season had told a different story. And by the time the county finally understood it, Clara Whitaker had already saved the farm.